We're here for 1 hour of looking at Dutch history of payments in the Netherlands, a century of Dutch retail payments. And first of all, we are in the auditorium of the Leidse University here in The Hague. And I am lucky to be able to present to you here due to the welcome invitation by the Economische Statistische Berichten to use the same room that they will be using for the conference later on this afternoon with all the high top officials of the Central Bank, the Competition Authority and the European Commission. The room was still vacant for the first part of the afternoon, and I volunteered. I said, are you aware of the significance of this date? And we should know, I should note that this date, the 18th of January, is actually not exactly 100 years later than the start of consumer payments in the Netherlands. It's 100 years and 2 days later. So, but that was of course to cheat a bit on history and make sure that I could combine with the conference. Jasper told me, well, you can also say this was exactly 100 years after the first crediting of an account occurred, and that is absolutely true. So we are here 100 years, exactly 100 years after the first crediting of consumer accounts at the postal Giro services occurred. Welcome. You've seen the invitation and you've seen this beautiful picture. This is actually a beautiful blueprint that I will explain later on. Well, let's have a look. First of all, the very small building. We are in The Hague, of course, and The Hague is the place where the postal Giro services started. So that's why this location is fun. The Van Spijkstraat 14 was the location where they started. And actually the buying a building for the postal Giro services was a bit of a problem. They found an old factory, they bought it cheaply, they figured. And then when they started looking at it, they had to go over budget a zillion times to redo the interior. So the actual building that became the head office of the postal Giro services, a former factory, and already in the first year of their existence. So they didn't really start from here. They had to redo the interior. So for quite some time, there was a discussion in Parliament. The minister had to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, gone over budget, but it was really a mess. The stuff that I got." So that was the issue here. But a very beautiful building with a paternoster lift, and it really creates a lot of memories with people from the former postal Giro services. If you speak about the building, there's actually a Facebook group of people who've all worked in this building and sending messages about all the stuff that happened there. So that's The Hague. That's why we're here in The Hague. That's why the location is beautiful. And my story of today will be about notes, some notes, banknotes, but moving from banknotes to coins. And I've put this slide up to make sure that I make some preliminary remarks, because what do we see on the left-hand side and what do we see on the right-hand side? That's sort of the worlds in which I live, and the one is the model and the other one is reality. So when you read about payments, you can take the perspective of what's reality. Well, reality is a crumbled banknote. It's not the beautiful thing that the ECB shows when they do a press conference. It's the stuff that's being used in practice. And in a similar vein, you can look at the world in the way you want it to be, or the world as it is. You can look at the world of institutional change. Why does society move over from cash to a Giro system? And you can look at it from a theoretical perspective or from a practical perspective. And I think there's a big gap between the two. At least I experience a big gap because I read these scientific papers and I think, oh, well, I'm not sure if I'm still there, if I've got these fixed theories on interchange fees stuff. I always end up feeling, yeah, but that's not what happened. That's not what happened. Where's Ruud? Ruud, for example, he pointed out to me, don't forget that the emergence of point-of-sale payments in the Netherlands really got a big impetus by the fact of a huge robbery at the Albert Heijn, where a violent robbery really created the energy to move forwards in point-of-sale systems. And these events you can't find if you take data and you say, well, I have data from this country, that country, and I explain with a log scale and all that stuff. People are explaining stuff about payments, and I think there's a need to look broader at both the dynamics, the fundamental dynamics, the economical dynamics, but also at the people dynamics that are relevant. So that's what I try to reconcile. There's a rational approach, and there's the irrational approach, let's say the human reality. And what I'm doing today is picking some bits and pieces from a publication that I'm heavily working on, I should say. And it's about the history of consumer payments in the Netherlands. And I seek to take a broad view so that people have a feeling, readers have a feeling, what not to miss. Don't focus too much on one discipline. Take a broader view, so make sure you understand the dynamics properly. And that's my goal, and I hope to provide people with a broader perspective, a different perspective, so that scientists may rethink their models and reality and model world come a little bit closer. So that's why we will see the banknotes appear. I'm also slicing as a sandwich the pieces and bits and pieces of my presentation. First of all, the years that I'll be covering effectively will be from 1900, because I have the data from 1900, so I figured I'll take the data, and also the discussion on Giro services already starts in 1902. So these are the, this is the amount of cash in circulation compared to the amount of cash and liquid deposits. So essentially this is the amount, you can see the percentage that cash is in the liquid available money in society. And it's really high in the beginning, and then it gets slower. And if we look at it, we can really see the obvious change in the early century, the First World War. A huge decline in cash, cash shortage, emergency money occurring. We have a depression later on, and the use of cash increases, and then the Second World War with the cleaning up of the money amounts and the money circulation. So these are the turbulent pre-war years, and I'll talk a bit about these pre-war years because they are less well known than the post-war years. So that's going to be, I'm going to highlight some elements of those years. And then later on, after the war, we'll see, I put the Brabantia savings box in place. It is mainly a cash-based society, and we'll see how gradually cash is phased out by innovation and competition. So let's go first for the start of the postal Giro services. If you look at the records, most people rewrite what other people write, and then they say, yeah, it was 1904. And the Chambers of Commerce said there was a need for easy payment mechanisms for small companies and consumers. But effectively, there's been one socialist member of parliament who was earlier, but he was sort of out of tune, or his basic idea wasn't heard, or it was heard, but he was ridiculed by the banking society. It occurred at the moment that the Dutch central bank had to renew its license. That central bank was a private bank, it had to renew its license, and then the question was, okay, what are we going to allow the central bank to do? They can print banknotes, they can do this, they can provide credit, emergency credit, and those types of moments are moments when change may occur. And that guy said, well, there's a lot going on, but I think actually we should make the central bank a state-owned entity. Which was sort of out of the box in those days, because it was a private player for good reasons. And he said, no, it should be a state player, and while we're at it, they should also hook up with the post offices, and they should expand their operations. They should basically become the central bank for the people. And then you see this in-crowd financial columnist in one of the papers. Ah, and there we have Mr. Bos from way up north in Groningen, and he's telling us it should become a state bank. Oh, let's imagine how this should work. And then you see him ridiculing the idea without sort of taking the underlying question, well, is there a demand in the market? And should the demand be solved? Yes or no? So that's the first one. He's ridiculed in banking land, but actually a couple of years later, the Chambers of Commerce echo the sentiment. There is actually a need. If you look at payments, it was a lot of cash, and if you would want to transfer money, you could either transport money, just put it in a box, give it to a transport company like Van Gent and Loos and say, good luck, and then bring it to someone else. Or you could go to the post office, and then you'd send a post whistle. And that would also cost you a certain amount of money, depending on where you would want to send it. And the mechanism of the post whistles was cumbersome and slow and costly. So the question was, are there no better alternatives, especially for the lower part of the market? Let's have a look. The discussion on better gyro payments, it was sort of in the air. There were discussions in The Economist, a newspaper, or a magazine, but also a banker visiting. He figured, well, we can do this. He was the director of the Javase Bank. He made a study trip to study securities and payment systems, and he said, well, I think I have an idea. The landscape of banking at that point in time was there were a lot of small banks, some bigger banks, and 3 very important cashiers. And cashiers had a main business model of basically payment factories. Generally, they would mostly do payments rather than lending out money. He wrote a book after his study trip, and he said, well, I think we could make payments more efficient. And if you remember the graphic I showed at the first slide, this graphic actually is the visual representation of what he wrote. He said we put 3 cashiers in the center who do clearing and settlement with the central bank, and everyone else hooks up to banks and other counterparties. So we create, actually the circle image is a more round form of what we call the 4-corner model. But you can see different players in the 4-corner model. So it's a different representation of the classic payment system. Well, he immediately got a lot of resistance from his colleague bankers who said, no, we're not ready for this at all. Don't publish this. And the central bank phoned him and said, please, don't publish this. This will only put oil on the fire or whatever. It was very clear that the bankers weren't ready to introduce this. And there's a good logic to that. The bankers had manual processes. They would have had a hard time processing a huge amount of payments. And their business models were fee-based, and they charge a pretty fee for those payments. So getting that mechanism to work was going to be a challenge. But it was put on the back burner, or he was politely abiding with the culture of the time and saying, okay, I won't pursue this. He went to Java, to Indonesia. He introduced gyro systems there. So he got hands-on experience in setting up gyro systems in countries and making it work. And then he returned to become the central bank president. Meanwhile, and this is the idea of his thing, he said, well, set up a clearing with 3 cashiers. Meanwhile, the political annoyance had built up to such an extent that in 1910 there was a motion in Parliament agreed we should now move on with setting up a postal gyro system because it's taking too long. Ministries are telling us we're studying, we're consulting, we're studying, we're consulting. What's happening? Nothing's happening, so move on. And that created really the impetus to move forward. The central bank quickly found out it would not have a role, could not take an active or operational role. But they figured before we write this up, we go for one more time to the cashiers and say, hey guys, it looks as if the political momentum is now moving towards postal gyro systems. If you introduce a competing system, you might still be able to avoid this. Well, they set up this competing system. It was only for a brief period. At least it was for a brief period. It was in the air. It didn't have any effect because the political momentum had completely moved towards the postal gyro services. Central bank said to Vissing, "Oh yeah, by the way, you can now publish your book." So the funny thing is that in 1910 magazine articles you read people reviewing a book that has come out in 1907 and saying, oh, I disagree for many reasons. So some of the bankers say, well, there's a problem in Czech law. The Czech law is no good, and that doesn't work. So the question, why did we move to postal Giro rather than cheque? We might have had some legal issues with working with cheques on a big scale in a way that they were legally usable. Anyway, the momentum shifted to Giro. Vissering was allowed to publish the book, and of course the First World War came in, and it took some time until 1918, and then the Giro opened shop. So that's the first part of deliberations, and what you can see here is that there's a fundamental institutional change. That society chooses to introduce a state-owned company, a state-owned venture that affects payments for the masses, for the public, and for the small companies. I'm always sort of, you can see in this history that some of the discussion was delayed. You can see that well, Vissering shouldn't publish the book. The question is, why was it so slow? Did it have something to do with the fact that there was no general elections? Only after 1917 the public got voters' rights, so there was no pressure at all from electorate as to solve problems for the public, because they didn't even have a vote in parliament. So these kind of structures are relevant in sort of figuring out, was it actually slow or was it pretty fast for the days, or why did it take such a long time? But it's very interesting to see that it's the political momentum that really makes the change move on at some point in time. Now let's head for my next section. Let's see. Oh, there we go. This is the combination of theory and practice, so we're moving to a bit of modeling. And this is the industry dynamics in payments. If you look at payments developments, it's always an evolutionary path. And the path is dependent on a number of factors. And these are, you could say, hardcore economic variables like interest rates, size of economy, of course also legislation, the nature of demand and the status of technology. All these factors come into play. So let's build the Röntgen picture for this structure. What's the core element? What's the what makes payments work, and what's relevant there? And first we begin with the nature of demand in payment systems. And you should realize that the nature of demand in payment system is pretty specific, in the sense that it starts to become noticeable when things don't work. So that's when you start looking at payments and say, hey, what's going on? My screen is gone. Yeah, that's exactly what happens with payments. It's not interesting. Payments are irrelevant. The beamer was irrelevant up until 1 minute ago. And it became relevant because it stopped functioning. So let's get it back to work. And there's the other one. I've put it hygiene factor in very small letters. That's annoying. So it can only be annoying. It can't be really satisfying to do a payment. That's the essential element of payments. A hygiene factor, as it's called in scientific terms. It's only relevant when it fills. It's not a fun factor, and it's about something else primarily. And that's the core element to keep in mind when looking at payment systems and developing. So that's very important, because it means that you cannot do a mass scale revolution in product development based on a fun factor of a payment system. You can do this for niches. You can do this for niches that are crazy about some certain stuff. But the question is, can you do this for the public? I think you can't. And that's relevant if you look at the development of retail payment systems overall. Then one very other important element is the quality of payments, you could call it. We all type in a keyboard at the computer, which is explicitly designed in order not to mess up the metal hammers of a typing machine. So why are we still using this same keyboard today? Well, we are using the same keyboard today because we're stuck in the development. And this is the same for payments. Within payment systems, within the design and the evolution of payment systems, once you've chosen a certain route, you may get stuck in a technological choice which is very hard to undo. And these patterns are clear between countries, and you can really see difference between Giro countries or Czech countries. And it's very hard to try and figure out what's the cause of the differences. But I think there's a good argument to be found that one of the sources for the difference between Giro and Czech countries is effectively legal and has to do with the qualification of the payment mechanism. So if you look at, for example, doing a payment in the early 20th century in the Netherlands, if you would use a bank-issued paper form to do a credit transfer, you'd have to pay stamp duty on that form because it was considered a financial form and that required a stamp duty. Now, the state-owned postal services didn't charge stamp duty. So there's a clear difference, and the fee structure was also different, but these legal elements create a role in rolling out the path for payments. When in 1923 the postal Giro stops functioning for 1 year, you can immediately see a huge uptick in the use of postal services mechanisms, and then after that people revert back again to the Giro system. It's more cheap, and the stamp duty or the absence of stamp duty is a relevant factor in that respect. Also, if you look at other countries, France, UK, USA, you can see that the fees, stamp duties for bills of exchange are very high, but if you come up with a scheme or with a instrument which is not a bill of exchange, but almost does the same, then you can get away with a different fee, a lower fee. And this lower fee creates infrastructures that are based on check. So when looking at these differences, there are technological paths. They are continuing. Gottfried Leiband wrote a dissertation on the reason why a technological path is persistent. It's exactly the same reason why we haven't got a new keyboard right now. I mean, sometimes you're stuck with it. To summarize it very brutally, I would say. So that's the mechanism here. We are a Giro country. We were at some point in the early 20th century at a switching point. We could have chosen Czech. However, the Czech framework was insufficient. Bankers didn't move, and politicians felt everyone around us is setting up Giro systems. The Austrians have done it, the Swiss have done it. While we were sitting doing nothing, the Germans have introduced it. It's time for us to move. So that's sort of the momentum and the context within which our choice for Giro systems occurred. And from there on, it colored everything else that came, because the Giro was very instrumental in setting a benchmark in expectations on what to expect from payment systems. Then this picture. Actually, I wrote this picture in the context of our Dutch payment system moving to European scale. But if you look at our history of payments in the Netherlands, we should realize that at the beginning of the previous century, payments were very local oriented. The focus of payments was very much local. Cities were important, local players were relevant. The Amsterdam elite had a sort of closed shop in the stock exchange, and there was actually an association of money traders not being in Amsterdam, money traders for the provinces. The Amsterdam elite created such an advantage for themselves, the banking elite, that the non-Amsterdam players united to make sure they had bargaining power, and the bargaining power was required if the Amsterdam people had to send transfers to the region or the other way around. They had to work together, so they had to agree. And they wanted to agree on fees, they wanted to agree on the playing rules. And essentially a lot of the ideas were also not to outcompete each other, not to create too low fees. So it's sort of to try and divide the market between the two. And what we can see gradually over time, we see the regional economics in the Netherlands move to national economics. And then at the end of the last century, we see the emergence of Europe. So these elements are very relevant in looking at payment systems and looking at the core element, where does it happen? I've also put in that we move from cities and region to national, to Europe, and I was inclined to put in we're moving back also, and that's due to the latest regulation, European regulation. It contains a number of elements which are basically a step back from European harmonization, setting up national contact points and stuff like that. So it's still to be seen whether how the European story survives, but that's a different question. And then there's the other element, the nature of competition, the rules that are relevant, and the economic growth, the economic context, and of course the geopolitical context, all have an impact on the structure that starts to emerge in the industry. And for the Netherlands, with the Giro services coming up, there's the benchmark of free and easy and cheap payments. Now we should be aware that in the first year, the postal Giro service weren't free. They allowed interest on the accounts. They had a charging mechanism. The charging mechanism was need to be refined, so they were in operation for half a year, and then they lowered their fees because they found out that it was too high, it didn't work properly, and it was cheaper, for example, to go with cash to a post office and deposit in someone's account than to use the Giro system to transfer money. And they figured, well, that's the wrong incentive. We want people to use the Giro system. So a very important element, the postal Giro set the benchmark for free and easy payments, but that happened after their 1923 automation problem. They automated in the wrong way, they closed shop for 1 year, and after the reorganization of their, the central bank, one of the secretary of the central bank, Del Prat from the Rotterdamse bank, he stepped in to reorganize, and he said, well, let's be clear, no interest, improved operations, and off we go. And that's the switching point in a number of ways for the postal Giro system. It was the moment from which they had to choose. They took the interest revenue and they lowered their fees to a situation where they could offer services for free to the consumer. It also created an organizational trauma for the postal Giro, which every now and then in their history popped up. A strong focus on operations was a result. Let's see. Later on in the in the last century, we see new players, really outside players from the industry, then the banking industry entering and influencing the dynamics of competition. What I've put specifically over here on the slide, the orange dot NL, is the effect of the postal Giro mechanism. By choosing this fee structure, it moved the dynamics in the Dutch market towards getting fees at the business side rather than the consumer side. And also in terms of fee structures, you can see that there's a sort of historical or a path development. If a country has chosen such a direction, then it's very hard to suddenly choose a different direction. So, if we summarize this is sort of the summarized version of the slides before, and we have here a public policy domain and interaction. This is the industry side that I mostly discussed. Legal requirements are a sort of input in the industry dynamics, but legal requirements are, of course, the result of a huge constitutional domain with legislators, supervisors, and public and politicians influencing or trying to influence what happens in the market. And one of the next theoretic steps will be about this interaction. But first we'll move back to practice. I'm going to check my time. Yeah, I think I'm still doing fine. I've called this Meanwhile in Amsterdam. The early last century, the focus was on local communities. Effectively, in Amsterdam, there was a situation during the First World War where there was a very strong choice for doing stuff as a government. For example, private-owned water transport was made public, as were gas, utility provisions. They all moved back sort of in government hands. So that's sort of the trend of that moment, socialist-inspired community council, city council. And we have here Mr. De Vries, who's the executive at the municipal board of Amsterdam. And there's a conference. Effectively what happened is De Vries and his employees, the civil servants of Amsterdam, had read the book by Vissering. They read it and they figured, yeah, that makes sense, this model. So there was a conference and there was a war, First World War ruling, because there was no free provision of goods. Some goods had to be distributed on a coupon level, and those distributed goods were to be paid by the city. And in order for the city to arrange for this, the city had to formulate a regulation, a statute, outlining its capabilities to do payments under the distribution law relevant for the First World War. And that was basically the idea. They figured, well, if we need to draw up such a statute, why don't we think also about setting up a gyro system for the city itself? Rather than having cash runners basically collect all the utilities funds at each address, we can do this on a gyro basis, which is much more efficient. And this is again the blueprint. If you take the book from Vissering, this is the blueprint that you would that you could sketch. And that's the civil servant in Amsterdam who done that and who made this one. And you can see in the center there are the cashiers who do clearing, important clearing players. The clearing happens here, and over here are the bankers, cashiers, commissionaires, city services, post offices. So you see the retail side of the picture over here, and then inwards to the clearing and the settlement part. So it's a four-corner model, but it's round, and it's more elegant, and it's Art Deco style, so it's really, really fun, I think. So this is in the mind of the city of Amsterdam, but they know they can't fulfill this dream. The city, the choice to make the Dutch postal gyro systems had already been made. So they go for the sub-optimization in setting up the Amsterdam dream, setting up the Amsterdam gyro. And that's the guy, Keegstra, is the mastermind behind it. And the logo of the city gyro of Amsterdam is effectively this blueprint, as you can see. So it's pretty much in the back of their minds. He was an inspector for taxes in Amsterdam. He figured we can centralize cash management for utility companies. They also had their own study trip to Germany to see how the Hamburg and Dresden gyro systems worked. And he was a good tandem with the De Vries, was the political engine, and he was the civil servant engine behind the mechanism. And this led to the creation of the Amsterdam City Gyro. And formally, the City Gyro started only for companies, and that was a political trick. So in March 1917, the decision on the table in the city council, we're going to set up the City Gyro of Amsterdam. And then there was a resistance from the bankers in the city council, and they said, no, obviously you're going to open it up for consumers at some point in time. And that was in their blueprint, was indeed to open it up for consumers. But then the political responsible guy, De Vries, said, yeah, well, we're not discussing that. We're just discussing, are we going to do this for companies, yes or no? So he sliced the discussion into two elements. He got the one and said, and opening up for consumers is a separate discussion for separate debate. You can choose later on if you want this, yes or no. And then, of course, 1 year later, they said, we're going to open up for consumers, and they sort of had to go with the flow. So that was the trick they did in Amsterdam. That's the reason why the postal gyro services are officially the first opening up for consumers, but within half a year, Amsterdam in May 1918 opened up for consumers as well. So they were a smart tandem, the two. They were housed in the stock exchange initially, and this is the technology of the day. And this is they were very keen on communicating to the public and selling the gyro system, and this is the Amsterdam City Gyro stuff. So this is the booklet, the information to customers. This is the deposit form, the credit transfer form, the authorization form, say the SEPA direct debit or the repeated crediting form. This is a cashback form for cashback at shops. So if you had a shop and it had a sign from the City Gyro, you could have cashback at shops if you brought your gyro form and signed it. And there was also an innovation going on there. And that's a very nice dynamic. This is this is clearly a banknote. It was copied and modeled after one of the early banknotes of the central bank. And this was an extension of how can we use these city credit transfer forms to pay at shops. This happened as a matter of trust. If I was a trustworthy customer, I could go to my grocer, and once a week I would have to pay, or once a month he would write down, and then I would settle my debt for a month. I could give him the credit transfer, and he would pop it in the mailbox, and the city Giro would just transfer the money. And if I was good for my money, that would work nicely. But it doesn't work for everyone at each moment in time, so a guaranteed model would be very useful. And this is a guaranteed 10 guilder note, which says either you pass it on to someone else for 10 guilders, or you write down yourself as the recipient of the note and will deposit it into your account. So that's what Keegstra devised. He figured, well, this is very nice, and of course, it's all about the signature. It's my belief that there's a personal prestige dynamics behind issuing banknotes. Rits Dijkstra may, as a senior experienced banker in the area of banknotes may recognize this. Anyone active in payments would like to be on a banknote, is my assumption. And Keegstra wanted this form to circulate as it were a banknote. That was also what was in the communications. And you can see this back. You see here a €5 note with Draghi, of course. And if we look at the 10 guilder note, I think Duisenberg purposefully delayed the introduction of the note so that Welling could be the last president to sign the 10 bucks guilder note. So these are dynamics that are relevant in this game, I think. However, he set out to introduce this document. Now the city Giro was set up, it collected funds, it was actually getting cheap funding, cheaper than it would have if it was to go to banks. So banks were pretty annoyed about the existence of the city Giro. But President Vissing of the central bank had himself introduced Giro systems. He was a very early adopter of the system, so he was in favor of the city Giro. And the bankers couldn't find a way to convince Vissing to be more stringent on the Giro. Luckily, Keegstra decided to introduce this guaranteed credit transfer note for use in shops. Because at that point in time, one of the directors of the Dutch Trading Society, the former ABN AMRO, or the predecessor to ABN AMRO, said, okay, this is good stuff, we'll go to the central bank. So he went to the central bank and he said, hey, look at it. They are on your turf now. They were basically competing with us, but now they're competing with you. This is a banknote. So classic reaction of a central bank, we need outside legal counsel. So there we go, outside legal counsel. What is it? Is it issuing a banknote? Is it in contradiction of the banknote monopoly? How does it fit with the central bank law? So there's the intelligent lawyer over here. And he said, well, this is actually a promissory bearer note. What can we do against it? Well, actually not that much. The only thing you could say is that it might be subject to stamp duty, in which case the economics of the note will make that it's not logic that the 10 guilder will then only be worth 9.95 guilders, and that would make no sense, and then people would not use it. So, but the lawyer said, of course, there's always the phone call to the city. So there's the phone call to Wieboud, who says, well, yeah, I'm going to suspend the issuance of the note, and we're going to have a good discussion about it. And he phones back. Of course, he says to Keegstra, stop it, but only for now, because we may continue. And then he phones back to the central bank and says, okay, we've stopped it and we look forward to the further discussion, which doesn't happen. So as a clear gentleman's agreement, this product is taken out of the market. And it doesn't stop there. That's the funny thing. What happens years later, in the 1960s, when banks set up their bank Giro system, they want to convince customers use Giro. They want to help them with giving them payment checks, which are guaranteed at the point of sale, exactly the same product. So they go with a proposal to the central bank, and the central bank says, yeah, we know that one. We had that in our files. What was it again? Let's have a look. Oh, yeah, there we go. Okay, so here's the good news. You can do this, but you must oblige the customer to write down the amount We want to prevent this becoming banknotes. So there's an example of institutional memory going a very, very long way. And even in the 1980s, when the city Giro of Amsterdam is bumping around doing stuff, it is still being sort of remembered by people of the central bank. Hey, don't do funny things. We know you have a tendency to jump around and do stuff. That's not the idea. So there we go. There's an echo of something happening very early in the last century and to a moment later in the time. Time for another intermediary point, which is why and how do we change stuff in society? We call this institutional change, and I think I'm an institutional change guy by nature. It's important to have a look at how legal structures change, why do they change, and what's the effect. And it occurs at many levels, and it's very important to have a good clue about the dynamics of change in society, whether it's technological or regulatory or both. And if I use my sort of mental framework, if I seek the best explanatory framework for understanding what happens in the market and with regulators, then it's essentially this one. Market players are basically market players. They want to survive. As a first rule, they want to be bigger. They want to make products, and they want to sell the products that they make. They will not go into a market and then not sell. They will want to sell. And their actions are also based on historical traumas. That's an element that I think is very relevant. History and memory, certainly traumas, have an impact on today's behavior, even if from a rational perspective they are not relevant. They still have a bearing on the behavior. Now, regulators want to survive as well. They want to grow bigger. They want to make regulations. They want to make headlines with rules and interventions. They don't want to study a market and then decide not to intervene. Although I must say, Frank, you just presented a report last Monday where you said, well, we did a study on the cost of supervision for in the market, and we will not intervene. We will leave it as is because we don't see a problem. That's actually contradicting my theory here. So there are exceptions, but generally you can say if you're charged with the obligation to monitor a certain market, it's very unlikely that you will sit on your hands and do completely nothing. So you will intervene. And also in that respect, traumas will have a bearing, or memories of traumas will have a bearing, as we saw with the guaranteed payment check. Now there is some scientific work being done on this topic by Kaiser and Ostrom, and it basically says you have to look at what are the institutional arrangements. It's a nested structure where events occur on certain levels and may lead to effects and impacts on lower levels in society. So you have the highest level of regulation, the in-between level of collective groups of players, and the individual firm level where stuff happens. And you need to distinguish between the two, and this will allow you to better identify the different interests and the different directions of regulations and industry developments. Now, there are two sort of basic roads towards legislation, in my view. The one is top-down, which is a regulator charged with a task to be a regulator says, well, I'm going to make a list of what's happening in the market. And then he says, that's strange. Some people wear blue coats, other ones wear red coats, the other one wear yellow coats. This is really funny. And now that I'm in the business of protecting people from the rain, I think it's my duty to say to everyone it should be gray raincoats rather than blue, red, or the colors. I mean, what happens is the effect of being a regulator is that you start observing. You start making policy because you want to order things, you want to put a framework around it. So there's the trap that regulators fall in. Start to regulate it because you're charged with a certain topic, and the fact of the regulation makes you move rather than the analysis itself. That's a top-down. You can also see a top-down discussion when you have, well, this is the central bank regulatory statute, we need to change it once more because it expires. That's a top-down. You start at the top of the institutional change with a statute, with a law, and you say, this needs to change. And from there on, you take the developments. The reverse development is the bottom-up, where basically a practical incident leads to a public outrage or public momentum and the need to regulate. Rather, because stuff happens in practice, we need to sort stuff out. And both have a mechanism which is called the train effect. So if there's a mechanism starting to revisit the central bank statute, this will be the moment where other players in the collective sphere will also enter and say, well, as we are changing this statute, couldn't we also add A, B, C, D, or E? And bottom up, the same. If there's a practical thing to be arranged in a law, no doubt that other interest groups will jump on it and say, well, actually, now that we're busy changing the law, can we also introduce A, B, C, or D? So this bandwagon effect will occur for both routes. But it's important to distinguish them because they have a different flavor in terms of their solidity and their movement. If it's top-down with sufficient energy from a regulator, it has a force which is hard to develop if it's bottom-up. Now, some mechanisms, the power of a threat, the regulator says, well, if you don't move, I'm going to regulate, which makes the industry very scared, jump into self-regulation. And then the regulator says, well, okay, thanks for that, and we'll declare it law. Sort of, you could say this is sort of the mechanics, almost the mechanics behind setting up SEPA, although there was effectively a forceful regulation starting that. The power of institutional memories. We've discussed the payment check event. But also in the 1980s, there was a discussion between the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank, where the Ministry of Finance promised the Central Bank, we are going to give you a law on payments, so that you are the competent supervisor. Now this promise is effectively being delivered in 2014. The landscape has completely changed. There's a European regulation all over. There's no need for the law. But the institutional memory is such that we have a ridiculous, useful law on afwikkelsystemen, which they call clearing systems in Dutch, for some reasons rather than settlement system. Anyhow, it's a ridiculous piece of legislation, but it's the effect of an institutional promise. So you can't explain it. If you look as a scientist, you were to explain it, you'll fall short of explaining this. But if you look behind the screens, there's an institutional promise that's being delivered. So that's another way of looking at regulation and how it works. And there's the power of persons. Sometimes things move faster forward or slower because of people. And one specific example is the example of Duisenberg. At some point in time, Duisenberg, as a Minister of Finance, has said, well, we need to move forward, and I think the postal Giro should become an independent institution or a state-owned institution doing payments system or a private institution. And in that discussion, he takes a position. Then he moves on to the Rabobank in his career. It's an intermediary step because later on he becomes a central bank president. But so far, the banks have collectively said, no, we say no to anything that's called postbank or commercial postal services. But now the Rabo says, well, we can see scenarios in which it's possible. The reason being that Duisenberg is Rabobank and he can't change his position. So Rabo changes the position because Duisenberg is there. And that creates a different momentum in discussions on setting up a postal bank. So these kind of stuff, they are the fun stuff to take out of the history books and show and tell to the public, in my view, if you look at the dynamics of change. Another one is that already in the 1960s there was a discussion on two payment systems, whether the postal Giro system was already in place, but the bank Giro system was being set up. In reality, there was a choice for a separate bank Giro system, and the postal Giro was a separate system. But there had been talks, and the two entities had been talking to each other and chose not to work together. And again, I think there were some dynamics at work, or strategic reasons. But I think that is also very much a power and a personal thing that at that point in time plays a role. And it may be costly because if you choose in 1960s not to merge two or not to use the same technology for payment circuits, then you're bound to work some 30 years to later on merge them together in a technical sense. So there's the power of persons. That's a bit of flavor on the dynamics side. Now let's see. 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll rush you through the rest of history. The early history shows that Keegstra at the Amsterdam City Giro, at some point in time, he wants to redevelop and redesign, and he wants to jump longer than is possible for his yardstick, pole stock, how do we call this? Anyhow, he wants to change more than the organization is able to do and then the city is able to do. He's being discharged, but he has a sponsor, Dai at the kasvereniging, says, well, come on over here at the kasvereniging, and then he says, okay, yeah, I still got this idea, you know this, what's the idea again? Yeah, gyro systems. Okay, I'm going to join the kasvereniging. So the kasvereniging suddenly pops up and says, we are going to issue a prospectus, we're going to set up a national gyro system. Look at that, guys, here we are. Dutch Gyro Center by the Kas Association. There we go. So Keegstra takes along the idea, copy-paste, and says, well, this is what we're going to do. And there's an interaction. The kasvereniging tries to convince the banks, you need to step in this great business model because this is really good for us all. Banks are reluctant to do so. They understand the need to standardize some forms, but they are too reluctant to do so. So kasvereniging moves on, and that creates its own gyro department. So we have 5 systems at that point in time. As you can see, the kasvereniging gets its own gyro department, and look at the logo of the gyro department. It does look somewhat familiar, doesn't it? So lots of stuff are being adopted by the kasvereniging, and eventually the Bankers Association says to the kasvereniging, yeah, you should abide with the standardized form that we use, and basically eliminates the possibility for kasvereniging to use its own forms. So technical battle on standards eliminates in the end the gyro department of the kasvereniging. Now, there was in 1945 already a group looking at which systems are there and can we harmonize. And at that point in time, technology was costly and changing work processes was costly, so there was no common ground to be found, and little coordination afterwards to resolve, to create a single system in the Netherlands. So that's where we are, and then since then, the National Gyro moved forward with its own path of innovation based on punch cards. Banks didn't recognize the power of the development and the fact that if the National Gyro would go that way, it meant that the whole government system would go punch card, and all other players in government would also do this. They used soft forms. Now, what happened in this period? There was discussion between banks and the Gyro on shall we harmonize, and it didn't work out. And the reason it didn't work out is because effectively, I think the bankers were at that point in time more concerned about the consolidation in their own banking industry. They had funding problems. They were busy doing mergers, creating Amro Bank, creating ABN Bank. They were not in a position and a mental mood to start discussing boring stuff about payment forms. So they just didn't discuss it. They missed the boat. They didn't understand what happened, and that meant that they basically got caught sort of in a situation where at some point in time the market shares were falling drastically in the gyro market, and bankers could see they had to make a jump into setting up the bank gyro in order to catch up in developments. Some technical cooperation, but a long discussion, national payment circuits and privatization of the post bank in 1986 was the moment where the exchange was being made. Okay, this is the start. There's always been a trade-off between independent postbank and cooperation on the technical side. That has always been, for good reasons, a joint bargain. So as of the privatization of the postbank, the time opened up to hook up the two systems more closely. And later on, we used some of the same mechanics of the so-called polder model, the consensus model of meeting each other and talking about payments and technicalities. We use that to also discuss the society impact of payment systems. So that's the technical side. There are many things more. If you take a fast picture of what happened over here, here we see the battle between postal gyro and bank gyro systems, leading to a first leg of elimination of cash in society. Then we are on a plateau for some time. We create a joint instrument in Incasso and Accept Giro. The first ATMs are being installed, and we move down the cash ladder with the introduction of the point of sale payments via PIN. And for now we are relatively, then we have a huge dip over here with the introduction of the euro, which is our lowest banknote position moment. And now we're back on a stable level where we have all kinds of modern technologies, but still the same amount of cash in circulation. So that's where we are now. What the future holds remains to be seen. We've done this part. If we look at the dynamics in the industry, it's very important to see that in the last part of the last century, the external dynamics, the threat of the outsider, is very important. Already effectively here in 1967, the introduction of the betaalkaart is very much stimulated by the fact that there's the competition of the credit card lurking in the background. It's a strong motivator. You don't see it back in many press articles, but you see it back in the press announcement of banks, that they are really concerned that the credit card will take over. They were concerned in 1980 as well. There was an agreement not to introduce the credit card in the Netherlands. Visa opened up the market in combination with a savings bank. There's a very nice story to tell. But it's an outsider, quote unquote, not really a fintech, but a foreign institution trying to open up the market. Then the point of sale systems in the Netherlands got their drive from Albert Heijn really pushing. There's more to say. There were the oil stations first. And there's a more complex momentum. Albert Heijn played a role, and CCV played a role in opening up the market for terminals. So we see a gradual threat of entrance always be combined with the introduction of new products. The threat of e-money on phone cards led to the introduction of chip card-based e-money by banks. There's a competition authority moment where the interesting thing, if you look, and that's again where history plays a role. If you look at 1989, the bank set up a collective PIN system. And then 15 years later, there's a lawsuit on banks doing this collectively. And the retailers say, well, this is a shame, it's a monopoly, it's a shame, it's completely forbidden. Now, why didn't we hear from the retailers in the first 10 years after 1990? Because the retailers knew they had themselves made a business case in 1990. They looked it up. They said, well, this is a huge investment of 10 to 50 million guilders. We're not sure if we're pulling this POS system off. So we're not going to do it. So they were happy the banks were doing it, and no way that they would argue you're setting up a monopoly, because they knew it was an active choice by themselves not to put a competitor in place. So the competition argument only comes when we've forgotten about history. And then the final ideal, and of course the last payment. Tom de Recht is here in the room. We made sure, guys, I'm sorry, but we hacked the system of ChipKnip to make sure that the last PIN transaction was being made by one of the debit cards or the ChipKnips of Financieel Erfgoed. So I've got the last ChipKnip transaction, and Tom has thrown it as the last transactions towards the processing house, basically because if you're into financial history, and it's all about the Dutch payments, you want to have the last payment as a trophy. So I've got the last Dutch payment as a trophy recorded. The footage is still under editing, but I first wanted to give you the shock surprise now and see how you respond, and then we'll publish it. So that's sort of in brief the history of Dutch payments, some of the dynamics. It's a preview into a more elaborate book that I'm working on. And as I mentioned, Financieel Erfgoed, I'll just say a little bit about Financieel Erfgoed. Basically, I've set up a digital museum, a whole range of activities, just to make sure that we keep remembering what happened in the past, because there are lessons learned that are too valuable just to ignore. And it's my pleasure to pick them up and throw them back into the community, whether it's a scientific community or the banking community itself. It's always good to have a new perspective. So we do walking tours, boat tours, presentations, blogs, workshops on the future of money. We have Twitter, Facebook, and the whole range. And again, thanks to the hospitality of ASB, we were able to present to you this brief history of 100 years of payments with some flavor of the dynamics, the practical dynamics, and some of the industry dynamics. And with that, I think we are at 3 o'clock.